know, if JJK and MHA could stop coming out on the same day, that'd be great. Oh, two of the biggest and most important manga of all time are finishing at the same time, and I only post 2 videos on this channel a week?
And yeah, sure, Nick, you can shift one of your videos from NC Hammer to the Weeb Commander.
But we have ads on every single video for the rest of the month on NC Hammer. We can shift no more. Even now, as I'm recording this video, I don't know when we're gonna post it. It needs to come out soon, because if you're not first, you're last. But I mean, you can be like 5th as long as you make like good enough content, and I make good enough content, because the leaks come out at like 11 o'clock at night, and if you want to be the first, that means you have to read the leaks the second they come out, and then you have to make a video, and then you have to edit it in the middle of the night, and then you need to post it for the next morning, and I'm just not gonna do that. Mostly because I don't edit my own videos, and my editor just had a child. But anyways, as hype as JJK has been in recent chapters, MHA has been equally hype. It's just not being talked about as much because it's not nearly as popular as JJK is nowadays. Because here's the thing, while the final battle is going down in JJK, MHA literally just ended. Yeah, you heard me right. Chapter 423 is like the last action-based chapter of MHA. Everything after chapter 423 is going to be a wrap-up arc. Deku growing up, graduating from UA, possibly being quirkless. In fact, almost definitely being quirkless. That was pretty much confirmed this chapter. Seeing his mom, All Might, and Bakugo getting their dust bones put back together somehow. Deku maybe marrying Uchaku, and so on and so forth. Chapter 423 of MHA is the story's done. And yet JJK decided to drop one of the hypest chapters it's dropped in a year or so, and so no one's talking about it. But I am. That's what I'm here for, because I want to talk about chapter 423 of MHA because it was incredible. Because not only does Deku eviscerate the final baddie of this show, but he also finally reaches Shigaraki. There's a touching sacrifice from a character who was able to toe the line between being evil and good, and a fateful farewell between 2 characters who had butt heads for 400 chapters. All the while, we got a true look into the real motivations of All For One, and so much more. This was an incredibly action-packed, well-drawn, and beautiful chapter, and honestly, a fantastic ending to MHA. And today, we're gonna be breaking all of that down, because today, we're talking chapter 423 of MHA explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you love the idea of me keeping you up to date on all things anime and manga, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So, chapter 423, the definitive ending of MHA, a manga that's been running for almost a decade, finishing its story. And while the popularity of MHA has petered out in recent years, looking back upon the entirety of this almost 500 chapter long story, you have to be in a little bit of awe. MHA, while it was never able to bring people into the anime community like Demon Slayer, Naruto, or Dragon Ball, was for at least half a decade the most popular anime and manga on Earth. And while the appetite of your average shonen consumer changed about halfway through MHA's run, which resulted in some people moving away from the IP, genuinely, I don't believe Horikoshi could have crafted up a better ending for this story. An ending with grit, resolve, teamwork, and meaningful sacrifices. An ending that not everybody makes their way out of, but the heroes prevail in. As somebody who's been openly critical about MHA and the decisions that Horikoshi has made with this story multiple times, like I am with literally any anime I'm watching or manga that I'm reading, I mean it when I say I couldn't have envisioned a better ending for this story. So how does the story end? Well, let's get into it. See, chapter 423 picks up where chapter 422 left off. That is to say, with a full-power Deku landing a one-for-all punch directly into All For One's chest. Now, at this point, All For One is some kind of chimeric black dragon human being, but Deku punches the human part of him. And sustaining this damage from Deku makes All For One realize something. That his regeneration quirk isn't working, but he can't seem to figure out why. On top of that, All For One tells us that the reason he wasn't able to sense and therefore dodge Deku's rather obvious attack is because the hostility of every hero on the battlefield aimed at All For One hid Deku's presence. That is to say that the hostility towards All For One from the likes of Mineta, Momo, Denki, Kirishima, all of Class 1A, and everybody else on the battlefield who was helping Deku along to get to All For One masked his presence, so that Danger Sense wasn't able to tell him where Deku was. All For One then comes to the realization that his regeneration not working and Danger Sense not being able to sense Deku must be from the fact that Shigaraki's body was destroyed, and therefore All For One, this incredibly weakened vessel, didn't have control over the quirks that he should have. On top of that, because of the realization of Yuichi's death, All For One is moving in something resembling a fugue state. Feel appreciation or understanding for the things happening around him. He's basically mourning. And it's at this point that we get a flashback to one of Deku and All Might's first conversations, to where All Might told him that the entirety of the power of One For All would make a human body explode if it was a weak body. And therefore, as Deku is delivering this punch into All For One's chest, he's telling All For One that he has directly received the power of all 9 users of One For All. And since All For One is in this incredibly weakened and decayed version of Shigaraki's body, the entirety of the power of One For All is too much for him. And thus, somewhat ironically, All For One begins to decay, his body turning into dust, much akin to how stars and stripes dispersed into the ocean. And as his body begins to decay away, falling out of the black dragon tentacle chimera monster that he had bound himself to, numerous heroes on the battlefield, like Hiroshima, begin to believe that the battle is finally over. But it's not. See, All For One uses a myriad of different quirks to take the parts of his body that haven't quite decayed yet and bind them back together. The most notable being his black rod quirk. I don't remember what it was called. It just allows him to shoot branchy black rods out of his body. And thus this horrifying image of a half-decayed Shigaraki's body held together through black rods begins to approach Deku. And All For One says that he hasn't accomplished anything yet, and that the Demon Lord needs to be absolute, and therefore he can't die yet. But since this body is very clearly destroyed, All For One has to start again. He'll have to restart like he did with Shigaraki. That is to say that All For One needs to find somebody to transfer over to, whether that be Midoriya or some other hero on the battlefield. So long as All For One can get his hand on them, he can transfer his consciousness and his quirks over to that person and restart the process of becoming the Demon Lord who eats the entire world. But since Deku is the person closest to All For One, it's Deku who All For One wants to transfer his consciousness over to. But Deku isn't about to let that happen without going out with a fight. And thus, as the creepy version of All For One makes its way to Deku, Deku powers up another punch. But before the two of them can clash in this possibly fatal exchange for the both of them, Kurogiri begins to move. Now this is interesting because Kurogiri in the last chapter was very much stated to not be able to create any more portals. As we could see, probably the emotional turmoil of realizing that he's now a Nomu, and also the amount of portals he opened to get the entirety of the hero forces to this battle against All For One have greatly weighed on him. And thus the fire that usually roars out of his suit was sputtering out. But as Kurogiri begins to move, Mike yells at him and says, "Shirakumo," to which he responds, "Shota, Yamato, I have to go. I have to protect Shigaraki." And thus in this moment, a combination of Shirakumo and Kurogiri are seen as the flames begin to dissolve around Shirakumo's face. And in that moment, Kurogiri remembers the time that he had spent with Shigaraki as a bartender for the original League of Villains. And thus Shirakumo, or Kurogiri, or whoever you want to call him, opens a portal between Deku and All For One, ensuring that All For One won't be able to get his hands on Deku. Now this portal that Kurogiri is opening between Deku and All For One appears to be the last of his energy, and it also appears to be his entire body, because from this portal Kurogiri says to All For One, give back Shigaraki. He has friends waiting for him. Now this portal is the only thing keeping All For One and Deku from coming into contact with each other, and is therefore technically the only thing keeping All For One from transferring his consciousness over to Deku. However, as Kurogiri was already low on energy prior to the creation of this portal, after Kurogiri tells All For One to give Shigaraki back, he begins to fade away. Cracking at the edges and dissipating, the portal begins to disappear. But just as the portal begins to crack and Deku is about to be taken over by All For One because his punch isn't fast enough to get to All For One before All For One can grab him, out of absolutely nowhere flies Bakugo. Propelling an incredibly broken and defeated body, Bakugo grabs onto Deku and propels him with his explosions. And Deku flies now at a greatly increased speed towards All For One through the shattered portal of Kurogiri. Mike, seeing the broken Bakugo propelling Deku, screams at Bakugo and says, "You should be in the hospital." And if you look at Bakugo's body, you would tend to agree. But Bakugo reveals to Mike that he had flown to the battlefield with his quirk, and he was able to catch up with Deku because Shoto made him an ice ramp that he used to propel himself at high speed. High level of speed that he transferred for Deku, who was now barreling towards All For One. And Deku in this moment is screaming at All For One, telling him he'll never forgive him for everything that he's done, but also says that All For One is not a demon lord or something incomprehensibly evil. But instead, Deku says, instead of this prophetic demon lord meant to consume the entire world, All For One is just a deeply deeply lonely man. And as their fists touch, Deku shatters the arm of All For One, punching straight up into his torso through him, ensuring that Deku wouldn't be taken over by the evil hands of All For One because they were now powder. And it's after he gets his arm shattered by Deku, we see All For One standing in a dark room by himself. Now, this is most likely a representation of All For One's subconsciousness, because as All For One is standing there, he sees a dim light off in the distance, and that dim light is Yoichi. Yoichi tells All For One that Deku's last punch had transferred the final ember of One For All over to him. And that final ember, the last ember that stayed with All Might and the last ember that stayed with Deku, was Yoichi, or at least the last fragment of Yoichi in existence, the quirk One For All itself. But All For One screams at this flame and says, I don't care about that. I just want to see your face. That finally having Yoichi in his grasp didn't matter, because it wasn't the Yoichi he knew. Yoichi as an ember then talks to his brother and says he's sorry that he failed to bring him in the right direction. But now Deku is allowing for both of the Shigaraki brothers to finally rest. See, the irony here is that it was always All For One yearning to bend Yoichi to his will, when in actuality, at the end of the story, it was Yoichi who was ashamed that he wasn't able to change his brother. But All For One doesn't accept any of this. He begins to scream at Yoichi, saying he won't accept Yoichi's passing or his own, and that he needs Yoichi by his side. And with this interaction, we finally truly begin to understand why All For One yearned to have One For All so badly. Well, obviously, a part of it was because the wielders of One For All foiled his plans at every turn. In actuality, All For One just missed his brother. The one person who was born into this world who All For One believed understood him. And thus when Yoichi ran off with the liberation armies and the first wielders of One For All, he realized he had lost the only person who truly mattered to him on Earth. And thus while his ploy to get One For All was about global domination, it was also about reconnecting with his family. But Yoichi tells All For One that it's time to pay for his crimes of using and killing so many people to further his goals over the years. And he tells All For One, who has returned back to his childhood form as he holds on to the ember-like version of his brother, that they're not alone in this subconscious. And it's this moment that we see all the previous wielders of One For All and Shigaraki begin to emerge from the shadows. And in the next page, we see Shigaraki from the darkness land a blow onto the vestige of All For One. While on the other side, in the light, Deku lands a blow on him in reality. And thus in this moment, Deku and Shigaraki's fists come together through All For One, as Shigaraki attacks him from his subconscious and Deku attacks him from the real world. And this, for the first time in Deku and Shigaraki's storied history together, they come into contact with each other without Shigaraki decaying Deku. That is to say, they're finally able to come together. And as their fists come together, All For One's vestige is completely decimated, gone. All For One as a character eviscerated. And in this moment, Yoichi is truly correct, as with All For One's passing, the Shigaraki brothers are finally allowed to rest. And once All For One is eradicated, Shigaraki and Deku begin to have a conversation. A conversation that opens by Tomura telling Deku that I thought I was going to be completely swallowed by All For One's darkness. However, Nana's vestige, the last vestige of One For All that Deku was able to fire into Shigaraki, was able to tether him back to the light, to bring him out of All Might's darkness. And in this moment, Nana was able to save the grandchild she never got to know, and finally fulfill the role of the loving mother she had always wanted to be. Tomura then says Korigiri's name and looks off as he sees the last pieces of Korigiri begin to fade away. And as he sees the last parts of his friend begin to fade away into oblivion, he tells Deku, even though he was briefly in control of his body, he wasn't able to destroy anything, which I don't believe. He destroyed a lot of things. He almost destroyed Mount Fuji. Half of the heroes of like all time are dead. But in this moment, Tomura follows it up by saying Deku was right. Inside of him was just a crying boy. And that's why as they stood there, their fists touching, Shigaraki couldn't destroy Deku's hands, which I also believe is possibly more to do with the fact that the decay quirk has been destroyed by Shigaraki being consumed by All For One's consciousness. But yes, absolutely, because Deku is finally talking to the true center of Shigaraki's core, which is a version of Shigaraki that existed before decay, before All For One began to augment his life to make him the perfect vessel to switch his body over into. That version of Shigaraki, the true version of Shigaraki, couldn't decay Deku's hands because A, he wouldn't want to, and B, He didn't have the quirk yet. Deku then tells Shigaraki that he continued to fight because he couldn't forgive the things that Shigaraki had done, but also because he wanted Shigaraki to stop, because he knew this isn't what Shigaraki wanted. He wanted the pain and the suffering and the sadness to be over for Shigaraki. To which Shigaraki responds, Deku, if Spinner is still alive, tell him Shigaraki fought to destroy up until the very end. To which Deku responds by saying, you managed to destroy what you truly needed to in the end, which was All for One. And it's at this point that we're taken to the final page of this chapter, where we see Deku in the air, in the pose of a giant uppercut, floating amongst what used to be All for One in Shigaraki's bodies, but what is now nothing more than black dust falling from the sky. And in this moment, the rain on the battlefield has finally stopped, and the sun is shining. Light has prevailed, and Shigaraki is gone. Yes, you heard me correctly. There was no, I reached out to the little boy and now Shigaraki's a good guy moment. Deku was able to reach out to Shigaraki. He was able to have a conversation with him. He was able to establish the fact that he knew that Shigaraki was augmented and manipulated from the moment he was born. Shigaraki was able to talk to Deku and establish the fact that he wanted to destroy the system that messed him up so badly. He died fighting against the entity that ruined his life. He destroyed one of the most powerful and important and dark entities on Earth. And in the end, Shigaraki's will to destroy was directed in the correct direction. It was Deku who was able to help him achieve that goal. But Shigaraki and All for One aren't the only people that are gone, because One for All and Yuichi have also disappeared. See, Deku understood that he only had an ember of All for One left in him as he charged against All for One. And it was revealed in this chapter that that ember was Yuichi, the quirk itself. And therefore, as Deku fired this final ember into All for One's body, he became quirkless once again. And with All for One now dust, that means the likelihood of Deku ever getting another quirk is quite low. Now, yes, Dr. Garaki has found a way to duplicate quirks and how to give them to other people and or Nomu. But the possibility of Deku going to Dr. Garaki for a quirk seems infinitesimally small. And thus, Deku ends this story like he started, a quirkless hero who finally got to lay to rest a boy he knew was struggling. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the perfect ending to MHA. Yes, I'm aware I've screamed about Deku getting his arms back, but Deku losing his quirk and Shigaraki and All for One fading away into dust, all with the help of Bakugo, is perfect. It's a full circle moment that cements Deku as the symbol of peace, the true and final destroyer of the symbol of evil on Earth, All for One, all from a boy who starts and ends the story without the powers given to the world. And that is... But it's not all sunshine and rainbows, because while sure, technically the good guys have won, in like a month and a half, MHA's manga is gonna be over. And sure, Vigilante still exists, but I haven't felt a hole in my heart quite this large ever since Naruto's manga ended. And the second that Naruto's manga ended, Boruto started. MHA feels like the first truly huge manga that I adored that's coming to an end. Because, well, sure, Bleach is over. I didn't read Bleach's manga until like a year ago, but I am excited to see how this story does truly end. And I guess we'll finally get to see if the MHA shippers were correct about anything they've been prophesizing about the future of this story. Needless to say, we do still have a couple of very important chapters ahead of us, but the hard part is over. That is terrifying. I am aging. But I'm curious, did you guys enjoy this ending for Shigaraki, Deku, All for One, Bakugo, and everybody else? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Woo! When JJK and MHA are done, I have no idea what I'm gonna be reacting to.